we were seeing things like big clients who would have databases that we had full access to, that we shouldn't have had access to. And the attitude throughout tech at the time was that encryption was just too hard. Weaponized design is a system or an interface that harms the user whilst performing exactly as it's intended to. It's like the OG digital psyops paper is this like unbelievably unethical weaponized design of the Facebook timeline.
The things that we're finding appalling about technology are not simply technology's fault, I guess, but is one of the symptoms of socioeconomic inequalities, atomization, basically all these downstream effects of our economic system.
This element of like bad outcomes as a result of a technology introduced into a society. Digital identity would create brittle societies because the societies would inherit the social engineering vulnerabilities of these digital identity systems.
This episode is sponsored by NIM, the world's most private VPN that protects your internet traffic and metadata. Unlike traditional VPNs, NIM uses a decentralized mixnet to scramble your internet data, hiding who you're talking to, when, and how often. You can switch between full mixnet mode for maximum anonymity or a faster VPN mode for everyday use. Pay in crypto or fiat, and even your payment stays anonymous thanks to ZK-powered anonymous credentials. Take back control of your online life at nim.com. Sign up today using the code BlockchainSocialist and get an extra month for free. Hi, everyone. You're listening to the Blockchain Socialist podcast, and I'm here with Cade Diehm. He is the head of research at the World Ethical Data Foundation and founder of New Design Congress and Parareal Limited, which is research and design research lab. And I met Cade a couple of weeks ago at the Cypherpunk retreat, where we were exploring and talking to some of the, I guess, biggest people who are working in the privacy world or working on technologies around privacy. And we had a really fun and interesting conversation while there, and I had to have him on. He had just amazing rants that at me. I really respect someone when they tell me that I made them angry when they listened to my podcast and they wanted to criticize me. So I had to have him on so he can criticize me to my face and see, tell me why I'm wrong.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. And also for indulging me in the Cyberpunk retreat rant. That was extremely gratuitous on my behalf. So I appreciate the fact that I had an audience that didn't judge me so harshly on it. Yeah.
No, it's fine. Honestly, I really enjoy it when, like, at least what I could tell from your rants is that you knew what you were talking about. And it wasn't I've had many people rant at me where they didn't know what they were talking about, I felt. So I enjoyed being ranted at. But maybe before we get into the rants and what they were about, if you want to give your own proper introduction to who you are, because you have a pretty extensive history of working in the tech world, both from the private sector and I guess you can call the public sector, the think tank, nonprofit side. And yeah, if you want to give an introduction to that, one of the things that I thought was really interesting looking at your resume was that you also, just like me, used to have a past corporate life at Deloitte, in which we both, at this point, have turned away from that life. So would love to hear if you want to tell your story a little bit.
It's a long time ago. One of the first jobs I had out of university. So I went and did a master's degree after my undergraduate in generative interfaces at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia, and I got a research scholarship for it, but did not finish. For a variety of reasons, made it all the way through to the end, and then didn't make it because of a number of like logistical reasons, which is something I'm not happy about to this day, but that's fine. And one of the first jobs I got out of my university stuff, I ran out of money, I had to start working, was I got the corporate job at Deloitte through a friend of mine as an analyst, which was equal parts. Deloitte Australia had just bought like a major digital services firm and a few years prior and had integrated it into their offerings. So it was sort of partly research based in looking at digital systems as they were developing around the time of the first iPhone, combined with executing on web properties, early applications for like large blue chip companies, these sorts of things. And there was nothing specific about Deloitte itself that turned me away from it. I mean, the work that I do now is it's much more nuanced than what you would be able to do. There's no space for the kind of work I do at a place like Deloitte or any of those like larger consulting firms, I don't think. But in terms of the thing that made me leave was that we were seeing, this is again super early in the realm of iPhone apps. We were seeing things like big clients who would have databases that we had full access to, that we shouldn't have had access to. And I'm not suggesting that there was any misconduct or anything here, but even just the fact that that was seen as a normal thing across not just Deloitte, but all of the larger consultancies that were doing the same kind of big digital work at the time was really something that bothered me. And this was, around the time that the Assange stuff had happened with Collateral Murder, the video that they leaked through Chelsea Manning. It was right on the cusp of the Ashley Madison hack. There was the iCloud photo hack coming up. All of these things were happening. And the attitude at the time, again, which is not specific to Deloitte and not specific to any one team, but rather was pervasive throughout tech at the time, was that encryption was just too hard. Securing sites and things like that was just too hard. Again, this is a time period where like Let's Encrypt didn't exist, right? We're talking at this point, Signal doesn't exist, Telegram doesn't exist. I mean, not that Telegram's secure, but whatever. Like, this is another world. This is like right at the cusp of the WhatsApp was like 99 cents and private and not owned by Facebook and not end-to-end encrypted. And that was really something that bothered me substantially. And so my first real collapse of trust in the system was not being able to reconcile those two things at the same time. Like the idea that we had access to, in many ways, a lot of expertise that wasn't available in other places. And yet, for some reason, I was, a junior in this massive white collar meat machine, and I couldn't get people to pay attention to it. And of course, there's lots of reasons for that. It's not specific to, I sound like I'm hedging, and in some ways I am, because I think that it would be the wrong thing to take away from this to think that it was like unique, that there was something uniquely bad about my time at Deloitte. It wasn't. I learned a lot there. And I learned a lot about navigating very, very complex structures socially as well. But it also makes a lot of sense in many ways, although at the same time, and I'll immediately I'll argue against myself immediately after this. It makes sense because I was a junior, straight out of university. I had no idea what I was doing. At the same time, I was trying to unionize the design team there, which was like probably not a good idea to do at the same time. And so everything was like I was seen sort of like I wasn't doing things the right way in that place, and as a result of that, like I was, I was not paid. Those concerns were not paid attention to, and also, quite frankly, I was young. I was super young. I was in my very early 20s. I thought I knew everything about very specific things around encryption, things like that. And if I were me in that situation now, and I had some asshole 20-something coming to tell me that like things were wrong, I would probably be as defensive as some of the people who I spoke to as well, right? So it's really, it was a formulative moment, realizing that I couldn't like make people care about private data in that universe, but it was like consistent across clients, across adjacent firms, across contractors, across everything. And I think that really, although I wasn't in a position at the time to do that, gosh, I have a larger story about this too. It was really, this is why I'm paying so much attention to it. It was really something that was right there all the time. And the reason why I'm saying that is because prior to that and how I got the job at Deloitte was that when I did my undergraduate and my master's degree, I had full fee scholarships all the way through from my work. And that meant that my work and my interest in my academia was picked up by Apple, for example, and I got a full ride to the Worldwide Developer Conference in 2011, I want to say it was, something like that. And there when you go in on the student scholarships at the Worldwide Developer Conference, again, like an incredible experience from someone very much on the outside. You go into this world and you're being courted all the time, right? Because you're getting like this pre-stamp of approval from Apple. I mean, they don't know much about you except the application you put in, and they go through some of what you've done and things like that. But they don't really, like, it's an early stage approval. Like, I guess in some ways maybe akin a little bit to like, other accelerator programs like Y Combinator and stuff. But in this case, you're also sort of testing for even maybe getting jobs at Apple and things like that. And so I'm in San Francisco in the Bay Area, watching Jobs do his last keynote, as it turns out, and I'm being given like these rides through meeting different early stage startup apps and things like that. I'm meeting senior executives at companies like Uber and Airbnb back when they're first starting out, not these exact companies, but companies of this caliber. And the whole time I'm sitting there and I'm like, wow, there's something really, really wrong about this. So like I have this tension point where on the one hand, I feel like I've been accepted into this world. It's the same as with Deloitte. And I'm, I could go anywhere with this stuff and I could, ride this wave that I could see coming, which was smartphone tech. And on the other hand, there's just something really like the cavalier nature of everybody towards the user is really throwing me off. And at the time, I don't know what I'm even talking about. I just know that there's something in my gut that's telling me that like there's something really wrong here. And so from there, I don't end up getting hired. I do a bit of work remotely for some of the people I meet in SF. And one of the apps that I worked on, I did a bunch of wireframing for this thing called Guitar Toolkit, which like ended up winning an Apple award. But I just did wireframes for it. But it touched an Apple Design Award winner, which is pretty funny. And then I end up like deciding, once I'm like realize I need to leave Deloitte, I end up working at one of the first crypto companies in Australia, which is a company called CoinJar. I was their first hire. And so like the beginning of my career is this period where there's so much going on that felt really off, and kind of being able to, and just by sheer fluke, completely not being caught up in any of it while sort of knowing that something was up at the same time. So then I joined CoinJar. That was my first serious role. I was their first hire, and for all intents and purposes, I was the chief product officer. On paper, working on design and creative direction, but also helping engineering. There was a very good engineering director there too, and we worked very collaboratively, and we built, with a team of like 8 people, really talented group of people, we built like an entire early stage crypto platform for Bitcoin. And this is the era where like it's 2012 and it's super early crypto. And I'm of the opinion that this is not a speculative asset. I'm like trying to build things that allows you to pay your rent. Like in Australia, for a period of time, you could pay your rent with Bitcoin, which was kind of cool. And I was really all in on the idea that this was about solving the issues of being unbanked. And
this was like through a separate platform you could pay your rent in Bitcoin? Yeah.
So there was this platform called Satoshi at Home, something like that. And it's so lame now. It's so cringe, but it's like, it was super early, right? And this is when Satoshi was like, the mystery was really there, It was super early. I mean, to give you an idea of the time frame, because people memory hold this stuff, Silk Road hadn't started yet. Like Silk Road started while I was like, it was really coming into being. Like like Reddit had dark web subreddits, right? Like this is
very early.
Things have changed a lot in this time period, right? And so, we do this work and we put together and launch this entire platform. It's an Android app and iOS app. They're both feature complete and written in their native languages, and not because like cross-platform software development sucks. PWAs are not really a thing properly yet. And so we have a team of 2 working on Android, team of 2 working on iOS. And then like these absolute monster CTO, like co-founder of CoinJar, who is working on the back end of the thing. And then there's a small design team, and there's me and the engineering lead. And we like basically build this entire platform from nothing in like a matter of 12 weeks. They have like an exchange where you could like exchange between Australian dollars and crypto, but like that was it. And we turned it into like an entire like bank account equivalent. And then immediately after that, we went and built this thing called CoinJar Swipe, which was one of the first bank cards that you could use. This is like at the same time as like Zappo, whatever it's called, was promising their debit cards in the US. I don't know whether we beat them or not, but we were like very, very close. We were right there at the very beginning. But of course, it's only Australia, and it's FPOS, which is like an Australian payment and money moving system that's not really used in many other places in the world. But I had this extremely fond Terminator 2 opening moment where, very much in the same vein as John Connor, Edward Furlong and John Connor, we go to a bank ATM machine with a totally blank like bank card, and we withdraw like 1,000 Australian dollars out of an ATM connected to a CoinJar account. And that was like that was a moment where you're like, wow, we're really like messing with things here. It felt like particularly subversive.
Right.
And then basically everything that happened, you know, like the unintended consequences of that. People thought that Bitcoin was private at the time, and they were, you know, we had instances, not many, but enough to really bother me, that we had instances where people were like posting on dark web subreddits, darknet marketplaces, the subreddits, saying, oh yeah, you can sell your like whatever it is that you're manufacturing, like you can sell your drugs through a dark net subreddit, a dark web, like a Silk Road kind of marketplace. And then like you know, get the CoinJar swipe card, you can cash out. And then we started getting like the feds coming and like, you know, taking user data. And I'm sitting there and I'm like, wow, these people really think that this is private. Nowhere have we said anything is private. They have to submit their driver's license or their passport photo in order to get one of these cards. What is going on here? And so what I discovered was that there's like this gap between what is said to be happening and what's actually happening in any kind of digitized society, and that gap itself was like, it could have no real like malice involved in this process whatsoever, but like that just the fact that digitization was inserted into a previously human only system would lead you to these unintended consequences and also misrepresentations or misunderstandings of how things were actually going in the world. And that was like the moment, I think, where I realized that like I had to do something. I couldn't just stay within the realm of product or work within the sort of startup scene. That I had to do something else. Should I keep going on this?
I mean, I think that's like pretty interesting already. I think just hearing that, I think it's easy to fill in the rest of the story of like,
right.
And then now, you know, focus on privacy, focus on a lot of the other work that you did. So maybe from there, I think it would be interesting. We could talk about, I think one of your more, I think, looked at pieces of work or concepts, which is weaponized design. So you've written quite a lot about weaponized design. You've presented quite a bit, and I think that'd be a great place to dig into it more, because I mean, there's an easy connect, I think, from that everyone is aware of like, you know, addictive social media feeds, or even in crypto, I think we're seeing it more and more, weaponized design, in terms of like, I think, you know, how easy and like frictionless it is to like buy speculative assets, which, you know, if you look at the marketing of, I don't know, Coinbase or, you know, Base, their layer 2 blockchain, they make it sound like this is like an amazing thing, how frictionlessly you can invest in things and speculate on meme coins and whatever else, and that this is the future. And I think there is something to say for, you know, this being ultimately framed in a way that is neutral, which is like kind of, I think, the story of a lot of tech. Things that are framed as neutral, as like an inherent good, kind of in a design perspective, as almost like an appreciation of like, wow, they designed a product really well. But in actuality, when it comes out to the public, when it comes to, you know, people actually start using it, it has all these unintended consequences. So maybe to start off, I think if you want to give just kind of like a high level, what is weaponized design and what do you mean specifically when talking about it?
Yeah, so weaponized design is a system or an interface that harms the user whilst performing exactly as it's intended to. So whereas it's great that you brought up the prevalence of dark patterns inside crypto Web3 properties, especially more recently, that is adjacent to weaponized design, but it's not necessarily specific to it. It's part of it. Sits alongside weaponized design, and when used together, it very effective. In the context of weaponized design, though, is things like when a platform begins to just broadcast locations of people, and it's an opt-out system. By design, the unintended consequences of that are things like, real-world stalking and harassment and things like that. Now, of course, like that example, which is one I use in the 2017 essay, which is when it was produced. It's my first essay, actually, which is, it's, a couple years after I'd been working in this field for a while. The example, one of the first examples I use is Snapchat turning on this like always on location sharing system, which immediately freaks out its user base, because its user base is not just people sharing their locations at Coachella or whatever millennials are doing. It's also, there's a huge sex work, early pre-OnlyFans kind of community working there, right? There's a marketplace for that stuff there. And so immediately those people are at risk, because the kinds of relationships that they have between what it means to follow someone when you're going to Coachella with them and when you're like following a performer of some kind is a completely different relationship, with the dynamics that are extremely different. And so by flattening that through a design choice into the same threat model means that the risk becomes extremely outsized. I mean, it's risky for the people at Coachella anyway, because who knows, what else is going on there with the location data. But for somebody in that kind of, who is, using the platform as something akin to like OnlyFans, it's very, very risky. And the denial of the team to understand that they have that diversity of use case on their platform, is that ignorance is a major part of that kind of manifestation of weaponized design. I used in the essay, I use the Facebook timeline view, and then how the timeline view had been made to be as addictive as possible, and then it was then used by a psychology team at Facebook to see if they could create like emotional contagions where you could make people happy or sad based on what you fed them through their timeline. Which that paper was published, I can't remember in which journal. It's cited in the article on the New Design Congress website, but I can't remember exactly where it's from, but it was retracted as a result of ethical concerns about the study. Really is a precursor to everything that follows with regards to PsyOps in the world. It's like the OG digital PsyOps paper is this like unbelievably unethical weaponized design of the Facebook timeline. And so these sorts of things were what I was seeing, and I was like, I mean, the iCloud photo hack, which I mentioned before, is the other really big one that I used in the piece, where I talked about how the issue here wasn't that people broke into accounts. They were very easy to break into at the time because, Apple hadn't fully grappled with the sensitivity of what they were dealing with. But the weaponized design component comes in the form of the treatment of every single photo in the camera roll as being equal and deserving of being on the internet in a sort of acclaimed to be private space. The issue really here was, and one that's still to this day underexplored, is that people at the time, when Apple turned on iCloud photo uploads, had no idea that meant all camera photos, right? Like, and I know that we know that. We know, especially if you're like deeply embedded in tech, that that's like the thing that we mean, like that when you say you're going to back up your photo library, it's going to be the whole thing. But normal people don't work in those terms. Like a lot of people, if you're not familiar with the system, you're compartmentalizing your photos very differently to how an engineer does that. And different photos in the taxonomy in your head they mean different things. They have different weightings. They have different levels of sensitivity. And it's that flattening, which is the weaponized design component of it. Yeah. So that piece, I think, it came out right around the time when people were talking about dark patterns, and it sort of filled in the gap of something else that was missing there. And that was really the start, I think, of what then became NDC, firstly in 2018, and then more so broadly into this decade. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you, what's interesting is that at least for a lot of people, of course, like for example, the Cambridge Analytica stuff, or just like a lot of these things, that these concerns around privacy kind of blasted off, I think, a bit during the first election of Trump, more or less around that time. But there is like a, you know, a very clear line you can draw from then to just like years to decades of research on how to do all these things that then were used or weaponized for, you know, by firms like Cambridge Analytica or whatever else via, you know, private markets. These are all private companies that were using data that they could leverage in order to, you know, coerce people into particular behaviors. And so, you know, I think it's yeah, I think it's a good time to maybe kind of move on to my next question, which is the particular presentation that you gave. I think you gave it in Osaka during Dev Connect as well. I saw a different recording of it, but it was called Ethical Design, No Thanks. So I was curious to hear your thoughts on what is the issue with ethical design, to explain a bit about that from that presentation, because I think it's interesting that the kind of, I guess, I don't know if this is the right term, but kind of like almost like centrist solution to dark patterns is ethical design, or just, you know, designing ethically is kind of like some sort of creed to follow when you're designing systems. But I think you take a few problems with that. And one of the examples I just want to point out that you had in this presentation is where you showed a video of a baby crying after parents took away the smartphone from them. So the baby was just kind of like looking at the smartphone, and then the parents took away, and the baby just like kind of went ballistic and started crying like crazy. So I thought that was a really interesting kind of exposure of kind of the, again, I guess, unintended consequences of simply making what seems to be neutral design of products like smartphones, and how that can, you know, intrude on, you know, the developmental capacities or the experience of life for babies.
Yeah, so that piece, by the way, is like the starting point, the real moment where I knew that New Design Congress was going to be a real thing, when I gave it at Osaka. To the credit of the Web3 community, the Web3 community has always been very, very, very quick to embrace and fully engage with the work that I do and my team does. And the starting point there in like October 2019 is absolutely no exception. For starters, being invited to talk about that topic at all, but then also the subsequent discussion that happened as a result of that was only really clipped by the pandemic, which follows like in, you know, 2020, almost immediately afterwards. The talk makes a central claim, which is that by focusing on ethical design, both in terms of decision-making processes that design teams go through, and also the makeup of those teams, what you're doing is you are almost, in a sense, running distraction against the structural problems of digital systems. And that's because all of the discourse around that time, and this is like your Tristan Harris Center for Humane Tech kind of part of the world, it's also to a great degree related to the ethical algorithm work that was going on in that decade, that sort of last half of the decade as well, with teams in like, you know, Google and Twitter and things, like putting out papers around the ethics of recommendations engines and stuff like that. And the criticism that I had of it all was that like technology is an accelerant for existing conditions, right? Which is sort of it's almost tiptoeing dangerously close to a Nick Land kind of accelerationist theory. But the context here isn't so much that is celebrated, but rather it is true of any technology in any context, in any point in human history. That the introduction of a technology, whether it's computerized or not, accelerates the conditions, good or bad, of that society. And there's nothing more to be mythologized or read into or pathologized from that statement. In the context of, you know, the second half of the decade, we had, you know, Tristan Harris putting out material about the dark patterns of Netflix and YouTube making kids into like zombies. We had the QAnon stuff that was like all the rage at that point in time, and, you know, we thought was going to be, you know, the peak of it before COVID hit. We had all of these systems in place, and the talk really dives into that work. It talked about smartphone addiction, as a kind of a symptom of time poor parents. This is an example, and don't read this as a traditionalist argument, but this is an example of societies where single income households become dual income households, and then that is then squeezed by a runaway economic cost in terms of not even necessarily inflation, just the amount of things that one has to pay for in a family of four, accelerating over the course of like 20 to 30 years. And how the smartphone offers like a simple way for time poor parents to ensure that their kids have any kind of stimulation without being totally like neglected, right? And the point is that then the baby that you see who like screams for the cell phone, babies will scream. This is like used in various arguments at the time of like, well, this is an example of how like terrible the smartphone is. And yes, there are components of that where this shiny, there are studies that show how like infant cognition changes over time when introduced too soon to smartphones. That's a real thing that like people have written about and argued for. But to sort of say that you look at a video of a child, an infant with a smartphone, and when the phone is taken away from them, they like lose their minds. To say that is a design ethics problem. It ignores things like that infant psychology, is such that you take away a toy elephant from them and they have the same reaction. It's an expression of frustration, but also that, yeah, as I said before, that like the reasons for this cannot be held specifically by the team designing the tools, because it's a symptom of a wider problem within a society. I argued the same. There's 3 sets of videos that I showed. The first one that you identified is the baby with a smartphone. The second one is a live streamer in a Chinese live streamer in a really disgusting bedroom, and the third one is a woman on QAnon on a live stream like screaming about QAnon. And in each of those, I then show, here's the claim that this information makes you like this. People are addicted to their phones to the point where their houses are messy. And then I bring in a central argument that dismantles that. So in the case of the live streamer with the messy room, I show how there's like interviews with Twitch streamers, really famous Twitch streamers, who say like, if you don't stream, you'd go broke the second later. Like, this is the economy of the situation. And then with the QAnon person, there was like a news report showing a de-radicalized person, a young woman who says like, I was totally lost until I found a conspiracy theory system, and then that was what brought me in, was my total atomization. So really the idea is like that the things that design ethics had, the popular things that design ethics said were caused by platforms and the design teams within platforms are actually symptoms of economics and atomization. And that by focusing in the last half of the decades of the 2010s, by focusing on these as design problems rather than structural problems of capitalism, was to miss the point entirely at a time when we could still do something about it. And that's really what design ethics no thanks is about.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think it's an important reminder that like, the things that we're finding appalling about technology are not simply technology's fault, I guess, but is a larger is one of the symptoms of socioeconomic inequalities, atomization, basically all these downstream effects of our economic system. So I think it was a nice reminder of that. And I think it's an important reminder in a time whenever, like, I feel like, especially in this moment right now, with around regards to AI, regards to, I mean, even crypto, just in the past few years, that like a lot of the problems I think stem out of these technologies are ultimately ones of capitalism, I guess. And then technology kind of on top of that, simply they ride on the already existing trends, if you want to call them that, or they socially reproduce faster the effects of capitalism, I guess, is kind of how I see it, I guess.
I would call it, so in my more recent work, I've started calling this a boom, extract, enforce cycle, where you start with a technology that promises liberation of some kind, the automobile, digital systems, whatever. Even industrialization itself is presented and delivered as like a radical economic opportunity. And then once it entrenches, whether through laying down roads or the investment into factories or the investment into cabling and infrastructure for digital systems, you then start an extraction process in that society where you reconfigure the society around exactly what you want with that technology. And then once you reach the plateau there, you move into an enforcement agency. So in the context of automobiles, it's the rise of, license plate scanners, speed guns, all these things that make sense, right? But are still still a massive enforcement system proxy that didn't exist in the, before this system became ubiquitous. The same with digital systems. The enforcement systems follow as everything from surveillance all the way through to the more insidious versions of this now, which is like authoritarian regimes sort of cracking down on people speaking through the promise of free speech interfaces that the digital world was supposed to be. And of course, in industrialization itself, enforce is literally the formation of modern policing itself, right? It is the baseline, the bedrock of all of this. And I think like what you're sort of saying here is precisely that system. When you develop a new technology and you place it under this particular structure, you get those cycles in repetition, I think.
Mm-hmm. So I think your work kind of reminded me of a conversation that I had with my friend Anuj Dasgupta from Smart Transactions, probably, I think we had an interview about a year ago, where kind of like his hot take was that designers shouldn't be allowed to work in the private sector, that they should only be allowed to work through their own guild or a union or some nationalized like entity as a way to kind of like prevent these types of things, or that like to take seriously like the ethics of design. Designers shouldn't work in the private market. I'm curious what you think about that.
I think so. I'm not familiar with that conversation. Like that was on the podcast, right?
Yeah, it was about a year ago.
Okay. Yeah. So I think there's a deeper thing that it would be so cool to talk directly about this with. It'd be really great. There's a deeper point here to be made, how the tech scene, which has enabled a particular kind of crystallization of an economic and power structure, was built off of the back of a deliberately atomized workforce that I think transcends not just design, but travels into the wider tech worker field. And I think very, very like directly back to the late 90s, early thousands. I can't remember exactly when it was, but there's this period of time where, no, it was in like the mid 2000s when Apple's leadership and like all the big tech leadership in Palo Alto and the surrounding area had like a gentleman's agreement that they wouldn't hire each other's staff. So they kind of artificially suppressed the wages of this entire region, right? At the exact moment when it was like, when that area was just popping off, right? And like, I think that is a really underestimated factoid of the story of how Silicon Valley's power rose and how complicit the workforce was in it, while simultaneously being like having the boot to the neck the entire time. And I think you could extend the idea of all designers should not work in the private sector to basically anyone who worked in tech, because this entire industry, until Meredith Whittaker and her associates pulled together the Alphabet Union and sort of fought against Apple, nobody could do anything. Like everything, there was no such thing as collective bargaining en masse in that industry, despite the fact that everybody was paid very well. So the risks were quite low because your salaries were high enough that you could potentially withstand retaliation from your employer. Yet there was no large-scale movement for many years. I mean, there were smaller efforts done in the Bay Area and things like that, but then nothing at the level of, what was eventually the Alphabet Workers Union. And I think it's a great idea. I just think you could extend it. Like, I think you could say the entire tech industry could have...
Doesn't go far enough.
Yeah, it doesn't go far enough. That's right. That's me. It doesn't go far enough. Right.
That's fair. So the next kind of, I think you mentioned it maybe earlier, but kind of a lot of your work more recently has been around digital identity.
Yes.
And you wrote this piece through New Design Congress called, I think, Digital Identity, Finding the Event Horizon, something like this. And this was also like a big part of discussions at the cypherpunk retreat. I think identity is like overall like this giant boondoggle of a problem in the tech connected to the state, connected to even private actors world. Like it before it was, Bill Gates said that on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. But I think now on the internet, everybody knows like your zip code,
Right.
like basically at this point. So, and digital identity is just kind of like, I think this holy grail that a lot of different types of institutions, not just the state, really, I think really private actors really want this as well. So just to say like I think oftentimes digital identity can kind of be framed as this like the state trying to capture you or like only in a kind of like somewhat conspiratorial right-wing type of way that I often see. But it's also, I think, something that private actors would love as well. But yeah, digital identity, finding the event horizon. What is the digital identity event horizon?
So we wrote over the last 4 years, one of the core pieces of work we did at New Design Congress was this deep study into digital identity. And the finding is part of a broader report called the Digital Identity Event Horizon. The finding I think you're referring to, if I just click this link here, is the identity accountability gap, which is one of the key findings out of 10 that we had. I will jump back to that. But before I do, I'll justify what this project is and why we did it. So as we talked about throughout this interview so far, there's this huge focus on the unintended consequences of tech, right? Whether those consequences that have been downplayed or whether people truly didn't know what they were. There's this element of like bad outcomes as a result of a technology introduced into a society. And one of the things that's really prominent across all of those is the role of the representation of the self in those systems, be it from the iCloud photo hack through to the Facebook newsfeed. The idea is that what that study I mentioned earlier on the emotional contagions within Facebook users, it hinges on this idea of using your identity in Facebook as a way of carrying the contagion to other people in your timeline, right? It's using the social graph of identities to create the mapping that allows for their experiments on emotional contagions to like travel through the Facebook network. So what I began to realize was that like digital identity is actually the most important thing and the most important battleground of any of the discussions or debate around digital systems, because ultimately, what is the point of a digital system if it's not to represent people within that system? There are only a few use cases. You can narrow it to an extremely sort of select number of applications if you're not representing people in a digital system. So at the same time, if you look, just through tracing from my career itself, like if you look at the rise of the economic damage alone of social engineering attacks through digital identity systems, it's exponential and it's global, right? So digital identity is the primary vector for attacking digital systems, and that's through social engineering. Just in the five-year period alone, up to 2017, U.S. companies paid an estimated $1.6 billion as a result of social engineering attacks. And in that time period, the success rate for social engineering attacks jumped by 15%, which meant that like by the time 2017, like this is almost 10 years ago, 3 out of 4 social engineering attacks were successful. And U.S. companies alone, just companies, were paying $1.6 billion per year in like recovery for like lost economic damage as a result of social engineering attacks, right? And the thing is that the 2020s themselves have like basically revealed themselves to be a decade of fragmentation and conflict. And with that comes blockchains, emergent biometric systems, and machine learning technologies. And all of those have this major impact on digital systems. And the basic premise of this report that we conducted over 4 years, the research, was that because we were worried that no current or emerging digital identity system was capable of fully fighting against social engineering attacks, that they would all remain vulnerable to social engineering. And as a result, as we began to insert these digital identities deeper and deeper into our society, digital identity would create brittle societies, because the societies would inherit the social engineering vulnerabilities of these digital identity systems. And that's largely what we found in this report from 4 years worth of work. Now this goes for everything. This covers everything from emerging Web3 identity systems all the way through to nation state scale ones such as Aadhaar or the Estonian digital identity system, all the way through to existing other systems like the Australian robo-debt enforcement, in which the Conservative government tried to recoup alleged lost or fraudulent welfare payments through automated identity construction, which was illegal and led to the suicides of, multiple people as a result of innocent people being targeted for these things. The scope of what we cover in this is extremely broad and then extremely detailed. And one of the main things I would say is that you mentioned the second finding, the accountability gap. This is like the two first findings are the most foundational in terms of why we have this problem. The first finding is that we are in a situation where digital identity means different things to different people. There's no universally accepted identity definition, and that people tend to understand digital identity through either their first encounter with it conceptually or through their economic interests, which is fine because that's how a lot of things happen, right? Like, that's fine. But the problem is that if we're then using this as the first principle of like systems design, it has to have an uncontested start point. And it just doesn't have that. If you're somebody who believes that you're working on a digital identity system because you're a Web3 person, you might think of and you're sort of working in performative or game spaces, you might think that an identity system prioritizes the user's curation of themselves. If you're somebody who works in fraud, you might think of digital identity as like a series of behavioral markers that allows you to understand whether someone is who they say they are or not. We had maybe 40 to 50 expert participants give qualitative contributions to the work. And what we found is that even those people, which ranged from people in the military, like high-level military people, all the way through to CEOs, nobody had an agreed identity definition, and everybody's followed the same pattern, which is that it was specifically tied to either their current work or their education history with regards to digital identity. That then leads to the second finding, which is accountability. If you can't identify something properly, you can't then create accountability around it. Because if it's amorphous and difficult to understand, you can't build any kind of legislative, punitive, or corrective measures to know what its responsibilities are and its liabilities and what they are not. And so you end up in this situation where a digital identity system means different things to different people, and then when it fails on us, whether through weaponized design or actual weaponization, nobody really knows who's responsible for that. And so it leads to these situations where, for example, biometric systems, when you pay for stuff with your bank account, are used to skirt, if you then are a victim of fraud, those biometric authentications are used to bypass legislation that requires consumer financial institutions to be responsible for fraudulent payments, right? And these are laws that go back, in some cases, hundreds of years. And because digital identity and what a biometric identity is and is not fixed, then you end up with these gray areas where companies are able to offset the costs of, billions of dollars worth of fraud onto the public. And these are like tangible real world consequences that happen right now, as we speak. It is primarily these sorts of accountability dodges that leads to everything from Musk walking in the front door with Doge and like wreaking havoc with Palantir on the federal government in the United States, all the way through to the insane amount of fraud that happens on everyday people as a result of digital identity circumvention.
Yeah. I mean, so the thing that kind of popped up for me whenever I was reading that work is that during my previous life as a corporate consultant at Deloitte, I actually did.
Too. I thought that this was just an analogy. You actually worked at Deloitte. Damn.
I did. Yeah. Huh. I was a strategy consultant at Deloitte.
Wow.
One of the projects that I worked on was at Swift, the giant banking cooperative that runs, international payments. And we were exploring digital identity solutions for them. and like all these different banking for their banking partners, because it's such a big problem. I mean, I could rant for an hour about Swift, but like the entire architecture that they have is like from the 1970s. It was not really made in a way that like kind of predicted or could have possibly predicted the situation that we're in now. It's so convoluted, it's so fragmented and divided. So they need some sort of like unifying identity solution, because like so much fraud keeps happening through the existing international banking system. Set aside, nothing to do with crypto. Crypto's not involved at all. There's already a ton of fraud in international banking and do the normal, quote unquote banking system. So they wanted a digital identity system, but these are all private actors that wanted something. And I don't know, I guess through the experience of that project, I wasn't leading it. I wasn't the manager or anything. I was still fairly early. It was, to me, it just felt strange kind of watching them flail a little bit at like trying to find a possible solution. And just like really what they wanted was a third party that they can put the blame on for the actual identity solution, because they can't make their own. Like to make their own would be like, they would be blamed for it. Like the liability issues are just too big. But trying to pick out who's that third party was also like a huge mess.
Yeah.
But maybe focusing a little bit on the crypto aspects of identity, because this has been like a big part of crypto, and kind of like also considered a holy grail in crypto for being able to unlock a whole bunch of different use cases, and however you want to put it. There was an interesting example that you put in that article about the World Food Program using a digital identity system, I think based on a blockchain of some sort, not really sure, but called building blocks meant for refugees. And this is something that like is often, I mean, depending on what it is like a little bit of a common use case like brought up as to how, blockchain can help the global south or whatever. But I'm curious to hear, from your research, what were some of the issues with this type of program?
So what are some of the issues? Sorry, it's like I'm laughing not because of the question, but because I'm like, God, where do I start? It's more about me being like, how do I even answer this? Less than the question. The issue, there's an entire chapter within this work. It's actually, I think, online. The report is currently delayed for a reason that we will maybe be able to talk about a little later, like in the next couple of months or so. But there's the dynamic of identity and refugees and crisis is like something that has been a flashpoint for like 150 years in particular. It begins with the flight of individuals in the First World War. And I'm going to skip over a lot of stuff here, so what I'm about to say is slightly inaccurate, but it's like, otherwise we're going to be here all day. Essentially, the movements of large populations from conflict in the First and Second World War is the starting point for the modern passport that we understand it today. This is like the overarching, again, skipping lots of history around this. The point being that refugee movement and the idea of escaping from violence comes with it in a sort of, I believe, a xenophobic way, a distrust of the person in flight and the claim that they are who they say they are. It's made way worse by the fact that like oftentimes the system that read them, whether that was a social system or whether it was a state, is also fractured or destroyed. So you end up with people who have to make a claim about themselves in another society's system and are unable to prove themselves by any metric that satisfies this other system. And when you partner that with these ideas around resource distribution and the allocation of decision making or resources to individuals who have fled conflict, it provides a perfect incubation point for identity systems that have quote unquote accountability tied to them. So the idea of you have somebody who's entirely disempowered, who nevertheless you're going to say, we need to ensure they are who they say they are, and also that they only take what is they can rightfully have. These two sort of absurd concepts, right? That there's not enough to go around, so they must only have what they're rightfully theirs under our own definition of this in this system that we've created. And that they must, despite being completely disempowered in this moment, they must subject themselves to, we must validate them in their entirety. And so programs like the Building Blocks program are these early stage systems that allowed for this promise of, well, we can actually like use iris scans and other biometrics to determine that a person is who they say they are over time, and provide them with the exact amount of food that they require as they stay in this temporary space in a refugee camp. Now, of course, the problem is multiple. I mean, aside from the fact that I find that to be a deeply dehumanizing system that is outrageous in an era of absolute abundance, it also like has particularly devastating consequences potentially as a result of where the system is inserted and its immutability, right? So in the context of the World Food Programme's Building Blocks pilot project in Jordan, the Houthi authorities resisted attempts at what they called ventriloquizing for the poor, and they resisted it from within Yemen as they watched what was unfolding in Jordan. And what ended up happening here is that when the project was rolled out, then the Houthis, the power balance shifted in the favor of the Houthi government. The aid program then had to operate within the context of the data sovereignty demanded by the Houthis. So this giant biometric system then was given, had to give access to the Houthi authorities as a result of that. Now, I'm not making a statement one way or another about like the actors in this situation, but rather like this is an immutable blockchain tied together with iris scans that like changes whose governance and access changes radically over the course of 2 years. That's an astonishing situation, right? And it's even more astonishing when you realize that at this point in like 2019, we're still, we're headed head first into a decade of authoritarianism, but we're not that far away from the historical connotations of like the IBM collaboration with the Nazis, right? Like in the 1940s, like we are, well aware of the consequences of large scale data sets falling into the hands of people who we don't want them to, or these systems were never designed to accommodate for in terms of the threat model. And yet here we are in 2019 with this exact situation where the power dynamics invert entirely as a result of a shifting balance of control within a contested region. What you saw in Jordan and in Yemen happens again at like a much greater and more dramatic scale. Again, when like Elon Musk and the DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency Project, walks in the front door of the federal government. These are systems that have huge amounts of citizen data that were built in many cases by people who followed the design ethics kind of thing. Like people, I left my job at Airbnb as a head of design in order to work with the US design, the digital core, and build these systems for civility and for the institution. Suddenly they're completely dismantled, they're fired from their roles, and then what comes in is like this giant data like accumulation system that over the course of a number of weeks just vacuums everything that's available and completely recontextualizes it under a Palantir algorithm, right? Like this is precisely what happened in 2019 with the World Food Programme's Building Block system, but on a much larger scale. And so I'm so grateful that you brought this up and that you've let me ramble about this on your podcast, because this is the sort of situation that we find ourselves in. And blockchains themselves, whether they're zero knowledge, regardless of the designs of them, these are something that we have to grapple with, because central to the concept of a blockchain system is the idea of a record, a ledger that is visible in some way or another to participants, and its consensus is key to the viability and operation of the ledger and of the blockchain itself. This means that each of the blockchain systems that we have built is a potential World Food Program disaster in waiting. It is a potential Elon Musk Doge federal government US situation waiting to happen. All we need to do is find a single flaw in Monero's blockchain, and it's all over, right? And yes, this is a fatalistic way of looking at it. Yes, I also agree that we need secure and safe ways, especially as things slide towards authoritarianism. There's something like 36% of the world's population is not living under some form of increasing authoritarianism, which is a bleak number in 2025. These questions, these designs matter, and we are just not prepared, I think, to grapple with that in any meaningful sense. And digital identity, in my view, plays a central role in that, both in terms of how we psychologically, as systems designers, create systems in our own image through this lack of shared understanding of what digital identity is and isn't, and then the dangers that are then emerge through, essentially the weaponized design, the weaponizable design of these systems. And that's like one of the key, and argued over 270 pages, one of the key arguments of the report, one of the key findings of the report.
Right. Yeah, I mean, this is kind of I think for a lot of people, disaster in wait type of situation when we combine weaponized design with digital identity systems. I guess like in the context in which weaponized design is kind of the norm for a lot of tech applications or applications using technology and such. So yeah, it kind of reminded me, there is this, I wrote about this in my book. I'm now forgetting the name of the guy, but he kind of critiqued Lawrence Lessig on like code is law type of stuff, in that he was saying that code is not necessarily law. Code is actually its own modality, and it's more akin to architecture, but it has its own thing in the sense that like code, unlike architecture, which by architecture kind of means like in a abstract way, like, the architecture of the world, how that kind of regulates society in a certain way. Yeah, like almost like the physical world. But instead, it's on digital systems, you have this kind of like immediate effect, a 0 to 1. As soon as something is changed in the code, there is like this immediate effect on everything. That this is kind of like its own modality, and kind of is not, we are still not like really remotely have the systems built up in place to kind of understand the consequences of all these things, or we are kind of like understanding post hoc the ramifications of its consequences whenever things go bad. But I guess the ideal situation would be to where we don't have to experience the bad things before we understand what those consequences are.
I love that you brought up Lessig. It's so great. Like the biggest issue with all of this, from that perspective, is that there is a massive disconnect between people who believe that code is law or that Bitcoin is decentralized and the reality of the situation, which is to say that like the thing that's missing from all of this, and the late David Columbia does a great job of explaining this both in the context of Bitcoin itself, but then also more widely cyber libertarianism as something that has inherent right-wing historical roots and core ideology alignments, which is that what it ignores is the skill cost in order to actually affect change. Whereas a democratic process, you just need to like raise votes. I mean, obviously those are perverted by, things like money and social engineering connections, etc. But at the end of the day, if you want to participate in a so-called democratic or participatory or peer-to-peer system in the code, you have to know how to read the code. And that is like the power centralizes around those who know the code and who can accept changes on behalf of the network into the code. And that is like a kind of anointed role, right? This is like, not to like name drop yet another fucking, sorry, I can't probably swear on your podcast. We're
believers in free speech here. We're believers in free speech here.
So I'm a believer in like discourse, as you can tell. So I will rephrase that if you want. But I keep dropping right wingers and weirdos in your podcast. But Curvis Yarvin is like another example of this, right? Where the anointed is like there's a disconnect between, this is somebody who claims that the institutions are, if not directly collaborating in order to produce consensus, naturally doing so via their positions in order to produce a controlled consensus. Thusly, you must capture the democratic systems and run them as a hierarchy kingdom system, blah, blah, in order to, I mean, essentially, this is why, Urbit exists, and these like the projects that they worked on exist. They are projects that embrace, without any kind of, I mean, they do have rhetoric, but they're baked into their design is the understanding that, like, the people who know how to code are the people who are worthy in this way. You either know how to code and you get access as a result, or you invest into it. So you provide capital, and those two, above all else, are those who have participatory voices. And then you have other projects, I can name a lot of them, who are on the left, who deploy the same systems and not those structures, and say that and then they're like, yes, this is participatory because, yes, you can run a Mastodon server, that makes it participatory. But no, you can't run a Mastodon server because it's hard. You can't modify the code base. You can't, I mean, the level of exposure, I mean, I've written about this extensively too. The level of exposure that one has from running infrastructure in a decentralized environment is extreme. From Tor nodes to Mastodon accounts, it's all dangerous in ways that aren't accounted for by the people who build the systems in the first place. And so at least the terrible irony of the situation is that for all of the things that I think are disgusting about Land and Yavin, at least the one thing that they didn't hide behind is the absolute belief in the systems that they designed, because they're the only ones like this thinking, this area of philosophical thought is the only one that truly embraces the limitations of the digital and the kind of power structures that emerge naturally from them, which is that if you are digitally illiterate, if you cannot code, if you do not have the prowess to be involved in the code merging and the deployment of these systems, you do not have a voice in it, right? That is the reality of the situation. That is a form of neo-feudalism that we now have mistaken in our own project on the left as something that doesn't exist, or that can be routed around by governance, whether it's DAOs or the commons or whatever. None of that has actually proven to produce a worthy alternative to the fact that all you need is a bunch of assholes with good coding prowess, and you can shape the system any way you want. Even the very basics of the tooling that we use, for example, the Linux kernel is a hierarchical system maintained by a small group of benevolent dictators who are aging, who are polarizing figures, who just happen to be more ideological aligned to someone like me than to a right winger, and yet the structure is still the same. And the reason why Linux continues to improve and get better is because that's exactly, it's not pretending to be governed in another way. And I say this as somebody who doesn't want these systems to exist in this way. But the evidence after 20 years is undeniable. There are so few examples of cooperatively owned systems that truly have made a dent in the world versus the ones that are controlled entirely vertically. And then when you then insert those systems into a society, you end up with a really dangerous precedent. And that's sort of where we're at right now. That is, the digital identity event horizon that we're about to cross is literally that problem right there.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's maybe a little bit of pushback I would provide is that, the cooperative economy being one of the sector of the cooperative economy is much larger than people realize, at least in the world scale. But I will say that definitely in the tech world in particular, there aren't many examples of large cooperatively owned institutions that involve technology. I think there's something I've been thinking about writing about, at some point about how it's easier than ever to be a king or something like that. Thinking of technology as the, extension of the self, the kind of original intention of what, technique or technology meant, that with these highly networked digital systems, the power of one person who is the admin of a particular system therefore has more power and control than like any dictator or king previously ever could have possibly hoped to have. And I mean, I guess there's like plenty of examples of for dictators or authoritarian governments using the technology, but I think in particular, the direction that we've been going as technology gets better or progresses, the more and more power a single person has the potential to exert if they're able to wield it.
I really love that you said that, because there's actually a section in the report that nails that entirely. And I want to just say, like, very specifically that you haven't read the report, so I'm not like coming after you for it. You've only read what's available on the website, but there is an area here that will be you will find very interesting. It's around what we call kill switch sovereignty, which is this idea that, I mean, you see this in Europe from the beginning of the year. The thing that I would push back on there, I think you're exactly right, but the thing that's missing there is that power is boxed, right? It is boxed within the constraint of the supply chain, all the way through to the operating system, all the way through to the network itself. Like within that fiefdom that you've just described, that king has to operate within within a supply chain stack that that person has no control over. So yes, they have this like surface level full control, and even within the context of sort of you're taking that analogy away from like the admin into like the real world, where you have states deploying surveillance architecture in the name of COVID surveillance or COVID response, which then calcifies into control systems. Even those rely on a stack that is completely out beyond their control, right to immediately the interface in which that system runs on is outsourced. And so the concept of kill switch sovereignty is this idea that as you digitize a system of power, it begins to answer to external actors and legislation that it previously didn't. So in this actually is in my view very exciting, because it shows you, I think, the first hints as to how to truly fight against global right-wing authoritarianism that's like addicted to technology, which is that this stuff is brittle, as I've said before. This stuff doesn't last under any kind of sustained assault. And more importantly, it's a mess of jurisdictions. And it is so straightforward. If there were actual countries that were the targets of these things that wanted to push back properly, beyond something like the European Digital Services Act, in which strong letters and fines are sent to US companies, if there were actual ways in which you can intervene and actually like trigger these kill switches that compromise the sovereignty of another country. I mean, the United States has been doing this actively to the European Union. During the minerals negotiation a little while earlier, a couple of months, probably a while ago now, between Ukraine and the European Union and the US and Russia, Musk stepped into the whole thing. I keep picking on this guy because he's not overrepresented in this report, but I think he's a figure that most of your listeners will be familiar with. Musk's Starlink was used as a bargaining chip within Ukraine as a way of getting a better deal on minerals in the post-war reconstruction for the Americans. Like, that is the literal definition of kill switch sovereignty. And so, yes, while a person can run some kind of fiefdom on top of a Starlink infrastructure, there's always someone underneath it who can do something about that. And that, I think, is the tension point that exists that so many of us are unwilling to confront. The second thing I wanted to mention is that, like, very, very clearly, I'm not saying that like cooperation is not the right model. What I'm saying is specifically that like it is rare to find that working in tech by the very nature of the topologies of how technology is organized. However, there are examples of this. There's a topic on New Design Congress called the Parareal, which we haven't talked about and isn't in our notes. And I'd be happy to either direct people in this podcast to go to our website and read up on the Parareal, or we could talk about it. Either way, I don't mind. It's just very much off the grid in terms of what you had planned. But the Parareal the consequence of the Parareal. Now, the Parareal, just briefly, is a state of being in which a user, someone sitting in a computer or being in virtual reality or otherwise interacting with a digital system, their real world, their material conditions that they exist in at that point in time, and the digital feedback of whatever it is that they're working on at that point in time eclipse each other like a moon and the sun. And as a result of that, they're in perfect sync for just a moment, and a third space opens for just that period of time. A great example of this that has been documented like consistently for years is when someone, a male identified individual putting a VR headset on, inhabits a female presenting avatar. And there's a certain number of people, enough that it's been written about extensively, that realize that that's the trigger for them of body dysmorphia, or like the understanding that they may actually, in fact, struggle with gender identity issues as a result of seeing their body mapped to a digital avatar that doesn't match the gender that they've presented as to this point. That moment where they're in that space, having that experience and realizing that is the parareal. It is a fleeting moment that exists in real time. That system, and there are entire communities across gaming, across subcultures, that basically live and try to cultivate that in real time, not as a form of a drug, but as a way of creating connection, but also out of that creating economies and marketplaces and things like that. The Sims is a great example of the parareal at scale. The idea of, hundreds or thousands of players, millions of players creating societies and then injecting their real world, or seeing the real world reflected back, not just by creating their own selves inside the Sims, but rather finding analogies between the narratives in the game and things that are happening to them in real life through emergent narrative play is an example of this. And what has that led to? One of the things we're studying right now is the multi-million-dollar market cap of Sims 4's, the Sims 4's economy of teenage girls writing GPU shaders and selling them on Patreon to make The Sims look more like a K-pop soap opera, right? At runtime. Like, this is what we live with, right? And these are systems that exist that deny, that disprove exactly what I've just said of the totalitarian nature of technology. But they are fleeting, and more importantly, they're also underappreciated by people on the left, and that's the problem. I think, like, we still think that like what we need is Twitter, but not racist. But actually, what we need is something completely different, right? That's the thing. And so many of these communities have starting points for that, and I think that's my counter argument to my own work, and that borrows very heavily from what you were just saying then around like cooperatives and things like that.
I mean, that's interesting. I think there's something maybe to say for like what people are missing when it comes to identity online is not that people even want to represent themselves one-to-one, from the meat space into the digital world, but actually it is a space for like experimentation with identity that helps them kind of realize more about themselves through that play with identity rather than by trying to map it one-to-one.
If you would indulge me for like 2 seconds, I'm going to read a small excerpt from the Parareal Manifesto, because it is precisely what you just said.
Sure.
Would you mind if I just read like one little thing from it? Okay. So this is about fighting back against like what the parareal isn't. So we sort of say like that the first popularized by the dystopian science fiction writers like William Gibson and Neil Stephenson, and embraced by Web3 and the likes of Meta, the metaverse is peak pedestrian, a capitalist desire to complete the process of financialization of what remains of the untouched self. This is what you're talking about with the one-to-one relationship between people and their digital selves. The desire to inform and perform one's own image for themselves and others, whether deployed as a lazy sci-fi shorthand or presented as progress to share or crypto hodlers, the metaverse exists to put down creative complexity and lubricate this process of fucking the future by making the possibilities of self-actualization as narrow as possible. Min-maxing power, clout, or investor return in the decaying digital wasteland depends upon the fabrication of new territories to plunder. But the lucrative models of software as a service lives or dies on its promise of no surprises. The immersive future they propose is set on rails and made as linear as possible. Paired with this is the reduction of the restraint of the plurality of the first-person persona, regressing the potential of the self in the mediated digital real-world hybrid back to the user. The metaverse, Ready Player One, Fortnite, Roblox, Decentraland, Call of Duty, Facebook Horizons, are all passive interfaces masquerading at a frontier, no more meaningful than the Web 2.0 platforms they proclaim to replace. There is no meaning or value to be found in a Zoom call, a Facebook account, or an NFT. Nobody seriously puts on a VR headset because they want to puppet their low-poly digital clone, complete with adjustable waistline thickness or optional wheelchair accessory, in a $2 replica of a white-collar prison/conference room. Nobody truly yearns to inhabit the image of a billion-dollar superhero franchise. Nobody wants your fucking DLC. So, like, the point here from this perspective is to say that, like, the closer that we get to digital identity that's supposed to map one-to-one, the less valuable it becomes, despite the fact that we financialize that substantially. And I think that that's the, again, to quote from this piece, is like, what Gibson and Stevenson failed to anticipate is the metaverse and, by definition, digital identity, the true horror. Despite the colossal infrastructure costs, the metaverse is really fucking boring. And that's the ultimate problem, is that what you find in places on the left, primarily, although not always, but, that are leveraged by the left in these sorts of what I would call like para-real economies, is they are first and foremost massive creative and performative places, first and foremost. And then downstream from that comes the identity. The identity itself is like central to that. Like, it takes this idea, if we have like a Cartesian idea of identity, you take the concept of I think, therefore I am with Voltaire, Descartes' like claim of the self versus the other, and then you like repurpose it into a digital identity sense. What we have is like, I authenticate, therefore I am, right? And what these systems produce, these alternatives, they produce this concept. It's just like a person is a person to other people. It is the participation and the assemblage of temporary identities and performative identities, which are then fed through a creative process that is central to that as like a starting point. And I think that's where those then create the kind of strengths and the stakes required for them to persist over time. And that's, I think, is what's missing as opposed to like, just any kind of Twitter but not racist kind of left-wing project in that sense. We went very far off of your question script. I'm very thankful for you allowing me to indulge that.
I wanted to ask this question just to hear your thoughts on it. Getting back to the crypto aspect. So we were both at the Cypherpunk retreat, which was this paid for a Protocol Labs, included a lot of people from various privacy-oriented projects like Tor, Internet Archive. There were like lots of different projects represented, both in Web3 and totally not in Web3, but doing important work. Experience, maybe not even just from that experience, but what are your thoughts on what are interesting positive light in the, maybe also, I think the things I think is interesting just for my own, curious to if you have somewhere to point me, what is interesting that like new cryptographic primitives coming out, as far as I understand, mainly because of funding from the crypto industry. So things like zero knowledge cryptography, fully homomorphic encryption is another one that a lot of people are into, where you can, do computation on some data set without knowing what is in the data set. And this one that I'm forgetting exactly what it stands for, IO, interchangeable something, but where you can do computation without knowing the algorithm. Anyways, lots of very interesting cryptographic out being funded by the crypto industry. I don't really know necessarily what the unintended consequences could be of them. They're oftentimes framed in the positive, but I'm curious if you do find things coming out of these spaces. So
the thing to, I think, remember is that, like, broadly speaking, my starting point with digital identity, and this goes from every single type of digital identity, right? Including the organizations who have funded this, from the Signal Foundation to WorldCoin to members of like Aspiration from civil society through to the Radical Foundation. A range of different groups have given us income, like have supported this particular work. My baseline begins and ends with the idea that digital identity is a net bad in its current form, right? It is also, unfortunately, a necessity, especially given the fact that the idea of proving yourself as a person and also being able to computationally produce something, whether it's identity related or something that you want to produce that's, sensitive, that requires external compute in any way, shape, or form. Like, these are the realities. I can't take a purist approach and say, like, let's just not do this because nobody will listen to that and it's not realistic. But like, my starting point with all of this is that this is inherently dangerous. It doesn't go far enough towards solving what needs to be solved. And broadly speaking, it needs to be paired with a complete rethink of digital identity, or at least serious grappling with the actual issues that are at hand. The interesting thing about encryption, again, this is coming from somebody, I mean, I worked on Signal 1.0. That was the thing that I did after CoinJar, was I went and worked on Signal accidentally before it was Signal. And what I learned about all of those experiences was that encryption is absolutely necessary. It is also not the only solution that we need, because at the end of the day, you have a pipe, if you like, that nobody else can see the insides of, that goes between person A and person B and then back again. At some point, you can still access the contents of that pipe, no matter what. That's the nature of the fact that at the end of the day, it has to be converted into some kind of signal that a human can read in many cases, whether it's like looking at it with your own eyes or something that is stored somewhere that you yourself can access. So there's always a way to access stuff, even with all of this defense that's built. The risk that cryptography produces that I did not really anticipate in the previous decade of my career is that it too is a kind of formalization of power, and is in fact by itself deeply authoritarian in a kind of more neutral sense of the word, not necessarily in a political sense, but it is authoritarian in the sense that the cryptographic algorithm that one uses in a system determines what is reality and who gets to access that reality or that data set. And as a result of that, that in itself is an appeal to a certain kind of finality that doesn't exist in a lot of like other parts of human society, right? Like, the idea of ambiguity and uncertainty is central to how humans build understandings, from everything from innovation all the way through to emergence of storytelling and things like that. The idea of discrepancy between how person A sees an event versus person B is what leads to everything from the arts to complete courtroom understandings of events. And I think that this is probably a very unsatisfying answer to the listeners of this podcast, but I think that each of these systems, the benefits themselves are extremely obvious. Like, a zero knowledge system, it creates the ability for an identity system to produce credentials or identity attributes, is the word I'm looking for, without actually revealing the larger identity system, is a huge deal, right? It's a massive deal. It also comes with massive negotiations around power, and these are systems that haven't been tested in those ways yet, right? The same with like the idea of computing data sets. I was just having a conversation last night with someone about doing exactly this, and I'm avoiding saying the word homomorphic because the person that I was saying it to was being very vulgar, and it was like quite difficult for me to like not like say that. So these are systems that are relatively new. They introduce this sort of enforcement through cryptography that's necessary for the privacy or the integrity of what's being computed, and yet still don't fully go all the way towards resolving the tension points that we identify in the digital identity event horizon. And as a result of that, are they then used as like an anesthetic in order for a society to think that we've resolved some of these tension points or these weaknesses, or do they accelerate certain things? I don't know. Like, this is like the work that we're going to do in like 2026 and onwards, is really examining these systems and seeing how their immutability, how their inaudibility, the uninterpretable nature of some of these systems, how we actually measure those against their claims versus their actual outcomes, right? What is the weaponized design vector of a system that you cannot fully see? How do you even understand what the difference is between abuse and system flaw in a system that you cannot like watch compute something? These sorts of things. Again, I'm frustrated even talking about this because I feel like my answers don't go anywhere near as, like, they're not satisfactory answers, but to me they're really interesting questions. Yeah.
I mean, if that's the truth of what you think, that's, I think, I think that's what it is. I mean, I don't have answers either. Like, I think for me, I keep up with these cryptographic primitives because there are promises being made, and I want to keep up with whether those promises are actually kept. And they seem like powerful on the surface, and that I like definitely agree. I think, photography over a digital space is kind of like the expression of power in many ways. And there is, I think, a lot missing in terms of like understanding cryptography from the left. I think it's almost completely missing, I guess, in the broader left, I guess. Cryptography can and cannot do. But yeah, I mean, these are the types of things that I want to keep up with, or I'm choosing to keep up with, in order to see whether or not we can, if not fix things, at least limit the damage of some of these systems that seem to be coming our way.
What I think, you're exactly right. And I think the pairing that I would give to that, to kind of consolidate what I was just saying there, is that, like, straight up, they don't solve the issues that we raise in any of the work that we've done, right, over the last 5 years. They just don't, because that requires a structural, there is a straight line between
Sure, yeah.
The design ethic no thanks criticism in 2019 through to the gap between what is said to be resolved as a result of zero knowledge versus what's resolved, right? And it's really important that I say that, and then qualify that by also saying that the point of this isn't that they're useless, right? The point is, or that the people who are building these systems are in any way misrepresenting them deliberately, but rather that we have this colliding mess of interests, motivations, and expectations that are predicated on an assumption that the answers can be found fairly within a structure, a digital structure that already exists, that has demonstrated the vulnerabilities to it. And so there are really two outcomes from that. You can either start again, which is like, not really a thing. I mean, it could be. Who knows what happens in the next couple of years? I'm not saying that from an apocalypse level. I'm just saying that it could get to a point where, like, digital systems are just completely unbearable to use for a variety of reasons. Or the other way of doing it is to intervene more. And there are definitely ways you can intervene smartly, like simply moving down the stack and intervening in different layers of the stack is super interesting. Again, like in our work, we've talked about how, like, Blender and Godot, Blender being the open source 3D software that basically has toppled all of the expensive for-profit, and Godot being the open source game engine that has emerged in the last 3 years to challenge Unity and Unreal as sort of a cultural force. These are examples of interventions that are a little bit lower in the stack that have resulted in, economic diversion, like forking in a meaningful way. And I think that's really, I think that's the important part here with this, is like, it's about critiquing these systems through the lens of the inner fundamental flaws that we have in digital societies. Of course, the main one being digital identity itself. And then realistically evaluating the promises against those. And I would say, just to wage this, I'd like to hedge what I'm saying, is that, like, most of the claims being made across these systems wouldn't dare say that they solve for social engineering, because most of them won't be able to, right? So it's not that I don't want to put words in people's mouths and to say, oh yeah, these are being made about, very serious structural problems with digital identity, and, it's not going to, I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that there exist a handful of these, like, first principle issues that nothing can resolve without serious reboot of that particular first principle. And it's about ensuring that in the process of convincing people that things like zero knowledge and homomorphic encryption and the entire sort of, even proof of personhood as another example of these kinds of technologies, as we start to roll these systems out, proof of personhood is something that we because I mean, we just spent 4 years looking at the evolution of deepfakes as a scam vector. It is scary how serious that has become. How easy it is. Essay, and then, like, set the entire, like, I did an audiobook version of an essay on the collapse of civil society in 2025, and then set the entire thing, J.C. Denton's voice, the lead character from the Deus Ex franchise. And it's convincing. Like it's a 40-minute book, 40-minute essay recording that sounds
Right.
like it came straight out of Deus Ex, came out of a video game. Like, that's a stupid sort of claim, a stupid example. But the point I'm trying to make is that, like, that took me an afternoon and a GPU. That was it, right? And like, this is sort of the world that we touch on this again in the digital identity report. This is like what we're up against. And I think this is why I'm so hesitant to, like, firstly, why we need these systems, even if they seem more intrusive, but also how we need to be already talking about where they will fall short of those expectations and not approach that from a place of condemnation, but really proactive. I think that's extremely important. Again, one of the other problems, of course, with this is that we're not going to really know where they fall short until they're actually tested in the real world. That's one of the things that we are really keen to work on, and in fact are working on, from the end of this year onwards. These are it feels like an unsatisfying answer, but I feel like I've given you something more than what I just did when, based off of what you just said then. Yeah.
Sure. I think you've definitely given me and I think listeners a lot to chew on.
Okay.
And I think thinking about the right questions and at least thinking about the right principles to be holding when thinking about these things and when being supposed solutions for, the world's problems through through zero knowledge proofs. So maybe I think definitely a conclusion to be made. No single cryptographic primitive is going to fix our digital.
The one that
and I think that's
fix everything. Don't you worry about that. I'm not
Okay,
making
yeah.
this. That's a joke. Sorry. It's a stupid joke. Sorry, I interrupted.
so there's one cryptographic primitive that someone is making secretly somewhere that is going to solve everything. We just haven't found it yet. But yeah, I appreciate you coming on, and I appreciate the rambles and the rants. Yes, the cryptographic primitive is turning off the internet, actually.
Yeah, 100%.
But if you want to just finish it off with any plugs, people keep up with you and your work and your research.
Great. Well, NDC is currently dormant at the moment, and who knows where that goes for now. But you can definitely find the work that's been done so far. If you do a little bit of Googling about my name, you'll be able to find a copy of the report that's floating around. But we will be publishing that, I hope, kind of soon, pending some events unfolding the way they need to unfold. Broadly speaking, though, I think just keep an eye out. Like I'm on Mastodon, unfortunately. You can find me there at host.lurk. That's like Shiba the dog, Shiba computer, or like my web, shiba.computer. And I think more than anything, like you mentioned at the start, we've started an R&D lab back in March. We're doing a number of really interesting projects there, including like an encrypted alternative to Substack that we're working on at the moment that does like ephemeral like publishing through any CMS that you currently have under any structure that you want, and can run like basically out of your laptop or on a headless server, headless on a server somewhere. That's one of our early projects that we're working on. And then in terms of plugging stuff, World Ethical Data Foundation is incredible. They have a forum that we're sort of working on, comes up every year. That's worldethicaldata.org. They're also, they do a lot of pro bono work for areas on digital security, and are in the process of security business, which is trying to build a research institute inside station, which is one of my primary goals for the end of this year and next year. So worldethicaldata.org is where to go there. I think alongside the continued publication of the work that we're doing at NDC, I think that is the major effort in 2026 is that particular project with World Ethical Data. Crazy organization, super cool. I think that's it for now.
Sure, that works. Thanks. I appreciate it. I definitely encourage people to check out those links, those plugs. I'll put them in the show notes. The New Design Congress is also a very pretty website, I will say. You guys have really nice animations for the different articles. But yeah, thanks, Cade.
Thank you so much. This has been great. Thank you. I really appreciate you having me on.